We are beginning with Chapter 10, Democracy in America. The American system was key in restoring the United States after the War of 1812. It consisted of creating a new national bank, a tariff on imported goods, and improved infrastructure. Improved infrastructure was not acted upon right away, but a national bank and a tariff were enacted in 1816. People weren't sure about having a national bank, but in the court case McCulloch v. Maryland, the court deemed a national bank legal under the Constitution. The United States continued to grow and change. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had 3 parts. Missouri was allowed to make a new state constitution, Maine was allowed to enter the Union as a non-slave state, and slavery was prohibited north of latitude 3630. James Monroe served 2 terms, and near the end of his presidency, he issued the Monroe Doctrine, which had 3 principles. The U.S. opposed any efforts of European colonization in the Americas. The U.S. would not be involved in Europe's wars, and European involvement in the newly independent Latin American states was prohibited. The challenge to eliminate property qualifications for voting was at an all-time high during the early 19th century. The Dorr War reflects this challenge in Rhode Island, where the people elected Thomas Dorr as their new governor. They also drafted a new state constitution that ended property requirements. Dorr would be arrested by the Federal Army for treason. Another state issue was seen during the nullification crisis, in which South Carolina wanted to nullify the Tariff of Abominations, which raised taxes on imports. They believed they had a constitutional right to nullify a law they deemed as unconstitutional. The bank war would become the most important issue during Jackson's presidency. There were many arguments and opinions regarding using gold and silver as money, or paper money, and paying for land. This ultimately led to the Panic of 1837. Native Americans faced much discrimination during this time. The Indian Removal Act, which was issued in 1830, provided funds to move Indians out of the South. However, civilized Indians were allowed to assimilate into the American culture. One court case, Johnson v. McIntosh, said that Indians did not own or have a right to the land they lived on. However, this was overturned in the Worcester v. Georgia case many years later, which said that Indians are a distinct people who deserve to keep political autonomy. The Trail of Tears took place in 1838, and the Army forced 18,000 Indians to leave their homes and hike from Georgia to Oklahoma.
All right, the peculiar institution. What does this refer to? This refers to the institution of slavery that was unique to the South after Northern abolition. One important idea is cotton. Cotton upheld the Southern economy and also contributed greatly to the American economy as a whole. The North benefited through cotton in textile mills and shipping of cotton, financing plantations, etc. There were some differences between Upper and Lower South. For example, the Lower South had almost exclusively cotton plantations, and they had the South's single major city, which was New Orleans. The second Middle Passage referred to the trade of slaves from the Upper to Lower South. This was necessary because the transatlantic slave trade was prohibited in 1808. Another key idea is that majority of Southerners did not own any slaves at all. Many instead were self-sufficient farmers, or yeomen. The paternalist ethos was an idea that slave owners had that they viewed themselves as kind, fatherly figures and took upon themselves the well-being of their slaves. They used this to justify their actions as being a positive good. Free blacks, the majority worked as farm laborers in the Upper South. They weren't truly that free, however, they did have their autonomy, so they were protected from being bought and sold. The standard of living increased for slaves due to the paternalist ethos and the end of the transatlantic slave trade. Without an unlimited supply of slaves from Africa, slave owners had to make do with the slaves in the United States and had to make sure that they were healthy and ready to be sold. Slave culture. The 2 important pillars of slave culture were family and Christianity. Slave owners used this to their advantage by using the threat of sale or family separation as well as force to maintain order. A couple examples of resistance to slavery. We have day-to-day resistance. This was very common. This was in the form of poor work, breaking tools, sabotaging tasks, faking illness, all pretty much meant to slow down production on the plantation. Another couple important ones you might want to know are Denmark-Vesey's conspiracy. No actual rebellion occurred, however, Vesey was a prominent leader inspired by both the Bible and the Declaration of Independence, and his plot was exposed, and many were executed as a result. Nat Turner's rebellion. This was a real rebellion. Turner viewed himself as a sort of black messiah, and himself and others went on a violent march that killed about 60 white women and children. This shocked the state of Virginia, and a very important thing to know is the result. Virginia considered emancipation, but instead slave laws became even stricter to prevent gatherings of black people, free and slave alike. This marked a turning point in the conversation about slavery and the fact that emancipation was considered. It really brought slavery into politics. A couple notable figures. We already talked about Vesey and Turner. Now we have Frederick Douglass. He was raised as a slave and had a slave childhood. He was then self-educated, even though this was illegal at the time, and he became one of the first prominent abolitionists. George Fitzhugh, on the other hand, was a pro-slavery writer, and he referred to white workers as slaves of the economy. So if you see anything by George Fitzhugh, it is probably pro-slavery.
Alright, so now we're going to get into chapter 12, which is about an age of reform.
During the first half of the 18th century, after the Age of Enlightenment, great reforms took hold of the United States. Utopian communities were created to offer a place for people with the same social, economic, and moral ideals to come together. Some examples of this would include the Shakers, who believed in the equality of sexes and living a life of purity, and the Brook Farm, who sought to equally distribute the tasks of daily life while providing education for all participants. The goal was a balance of work and leisure that would, above all, benefit the greater good. Along with these communities came the temperance movement, which was dedicated to complete abstinence in the use of alcohol. This was a conflict on morality, while some critics said this was an attack on freedom. Also, there became greater institutions to solve issues like overcrowded jails, a place for the mentally ill, and education for all. In addition to these societal changes, abolitionist ideas began to grow as well. The American Colonization Society encouraged the colonization of free blacks to Africa, and later Liberia was founded as a possible homeland for them. The American Anti-Slavery Society called for an immediate end to slavery and the establishment of equality for black Americans. But this organization will break apart in 1840 over disputes on the role of women in the society. Overall, abolitionists used a strategy called moral suasion that persuaded non-abolitionists that the slavery institution was evil. Literary works such as Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Liberator newspaper wrote on these radical ideals and portrayed the brutality and injustices of slave life. As a response to the growth of abolitionist support, mob attacks became frequent, further convincing Northerners to further support the movement. As the efforts continued to grow, more people petitioned to get African American representation in government offices. These new ideas scared many whites as they feared that the races could not peacefully coexist as equals. The novel Gentlemen of Property and Standing examines why the middle class would take to the streets in mob violence to vent their anger at anti-slavery meetings. In response to abolitionists storming Washington, the House adopted the gag rule, which prohibits any consideration of abolitionist petitions. Women across the nation came together to help the abolitionist petition and other social movements. Examples of this would include rejecting Indian removal policies. Women led by Dorothea Dix advocated for the mentally ill and their place in asylum. The Female Reform Society and the Gramake Sisters rallied for the protection of women and their rights in society. Importantly, the Seneca Falls Convention helped make women's suffrage and employment opportunities a greater social conversation. All of these ideas supported the push to end the cult of domesticity. The rise and empowerment of women allowed them to also be more active in anti-slavery movements. However, many argued over a woman's proper place in these efforts, leading the movement to eventually break away from each other. These seceders formed the Liberty Party, nominating James Birney in 1840 and 1844 for president. Overall, these efforts allowed women to become a permanent part of societal reform in the future, and abolitionists continued to be a significant part of Northern belief until emancipation was achieved.